The autumn wind carried the scent of dust and dying wheat across the Colorado plains in the year 1878, and Hester Sullivan stood alone in her field, staring at the only crop that might save Millbrook from starvation, when the sound of approaching horses made her heart seize with dread. She had buried her husband Jacob 2 winters past, when the influenza swept through the valley and took him along with 6 other souls the town had since stopped mentioning by name. Since then, she had worked the modest homestead at the edge of Millbrook by herself, coaxing wheat and corn from soil that seemed determined to fight her at every turn. This year, the drought had been merciless. Crops across the valley had withered to brown husks, and the town's grain stores had dwindled to almost nothing. Winter was coming, and Millbrook had nothing to show for the harvest season except failure and fear, except for Hester's field. By some miracle of stubbornness and careful irrigation from the creek that ran along her property line, her wheat had survived. It stood tall and golden, swaying in the wind like a promise the rest of the valley could not keep. Word had spread through town of the widow's harvest, and not all of the attention it drew was kind. The horses that approached now belonged to 3 men Hester recognized as ranch hands from the Colton spread, the largest cattle operation in the county. Leading them was a rider she did not recognize, a tall man with dark hair beneath a weathered gray hat, sitting his horse with the kind of ease that spoke of long years in the saddle. He wore a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest, though Hester had never seen him in Millbrook before. "Afternoon, ma'am," the stranger said, tipping his hat as he reined his horse to a stop at the edge of her field. "Name's Nathan Hartwell. I'm the new deputy marshal assigned to this district. These men tell me you've got the only standing crop for 30 miles. Hester wiped her hands on her apron, feeling suddenly conscious of how she must look, sunburned and sweat-streaked after a full day of labor. "That would be true, Marshal, though I don't recall inviting an escort to come admire it." One of the Colton men, a broad-shouldered fellow named Silas Reed, spat into the dirt. "We ain't here to admire nothing, widow. Mr. Colton sent us to make an offer on your wheat." "A fair one, considering the circumstances." "The circumstances being that I'm a woman alone, and you think I'll take whatever price you name." Nathan Hartwell's mouth twitched, though whether from amusement or discomfort Hester could not tell. "Nobody's here to bully you, ma'am. I only rode along because Marshal Boone asked me to keep the peace, given how tempers have been running short in town." "Tempers," Hester repeated. "Is that what we're calling it when grown men come to threaten a widow over her own land?" Silas Reed's jaw tightened. "Now hold on. Mr. Colton is offering you good money. More than that wheat's worth on any honest market, given the drought's dried up half the grain trade between here and Denver. And what happens to the rest of the town if I sell my whole crop to one man's cattle operation? You think Colton means to share that grain with families who can't afford his prices?" The men exchanged uncertain glances, and Hester knew she had struck near the truth of it. Amos Colton had built his fortune through shrewd dealing that often bordered on outright exploitation, and there was little reason to believe a bad harvest year would soften his methods. Nathan cleared his throat before the tension could sharpen further. "Ma'am, might I speak with you privately for a moment, away from the field?" Hester studied him for a long moment, taking in the badge, the plain, honest set of his jaw, and the way his eyes held none of the greedy calculation she saw in Colton's men. She nodded once and led him toward the small farmhouse that sat at the edge of the property, leaving Reed and the others to wait by the fence line, muttering among themselves. Inside, Hester poured 2 cups of well water and set them on the worn wooden table that had once belonged to Jacob's mother. Nathan removed his hat and held it against his chest, looking around the modest home with an expression she could not quite place. "You live here alone?" he asked. "Since my husband passed, yes. 2 years this coming winter. I'm sorry for your loss. Everyone says that. Doesn't put food in anyone's stomach, though, does it?" Nathan's lips curved into something like a rueful smile. "No, ma'am, I suppose it doesn't." He took a sip of the water she offered, then set the cup down carefully. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Sullivan. I don't much like the errand I've been sent on today. Colton wields more influence in this county than any one man ought to, and I've seen enough of his dealings already to know he doesn't offer fair prices unless it serves him some larger purpose. Then why ride out here with his men at all? Because Marshal Boone asked me to, and because I thought perhaps if I came along, I might keep things civil. I didn't expect to find a woman who needed no protecting from the likes of Silas Reed. There was genuine admiration in his voice now, and Hester found herself unexpectedly warmed by it. I've had to learn to stand my ground, she said quietly. There's nobody else standing it for me. Nathan studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. How many bushels do you expect to bring in from that field? Enough to feed my own household through winter, with some left to sell. Not enough to feed the whole town, if that's what you're wondering. But it's more than anyone else in this valley managed to grow this year. And if you don't sell to Colton, then I sell it to whoever offers a fair price and to whoever needs it most. I didn't work this land half to death just to hand my harvest over to a man who already owns more cattle than half the county owns cows. Nathan chuckled softly, a warm sound that seemed to fill the small kitchen. I think, Mrs. Sullivan, you and I are going to get along just fine. They walked back out to the field together, and Nathan informed Silas Reed and the other men that Mrs. Sullivan had declined Colton's offer, and that as the acting deputy marshal, he saw no lawful reason to compel her otherwise. The men grumbled but mounted their horses and rode off toward the Colton ranch, leaving Dust hanging in the amber afternoon light. Before he mounted his own horse to follow, Nathan turned back to Hester. For what it's worth, ma'am, I think this town owes you more gratitude than they've shown so far. A crop like that in a year like this one ought to be celebrated, not fought over. Gratitude doesn't fill grain silos, Marshal Hartwell. No, he agreed, swinging up into his saddle. But it's a start. He rode off after the Colton men, and Hester stood watching until his silhouette disappeared over the ridge, wondering why her chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with worry over the harvest. Over the following days, word of Hester's confrontation with Colton's men spread through Millbrook like wildfire through dry grass. Some praised her courage, while others, particularly those who had already begun making arrangements with Colton for grain shipped in from other counties, muttered that the widow was being stubborn and prideful when the whole town's welfare hung in the balance. The town of Millbrook had been founded some 15 years earlier by settlers following the promise of fertile land along the eastern slope of the Rockies. It had grown slowly but steadily, boasting a general store, a small church, a schoolhouse, and a saloon that doubled as the only gathering place large enough for town meetings. The Sullivan homestead sat 2 miles outside the main settlement, close enough that Hester made the walk into town regularly for supplies and news, but far enough that she often felt like an outsider looking in on the community she had called home for over a decade. That feeling of being overlooked had grown sharper since Jacob's death. In the immediate aftermath, neighbors had brought casseroles and offered condolences, promising to check in on her regularly. But as the months wore on, those promises faded, and Hester found herself largely forgotten, a woman managing alone on the margins of a town that seemed to have too many other concerns to spare thought for a widow's struggles. She thought of this as she walked into Millbrook 3 days after the confrontation with Colton's men, her boots kicking up dust along the rutted road that led past the schoolhouse and toward Pruitt's general store. She needed flour and salt, though her coin purse held barely enough to cover both, and she had resolved to sell a portion of her harvest as soon as it was fully brought in, regardless of what price the market might bear. Inside the store, she found several townsfolk already gathered, their voices hushed but urgent as they discussed the drought and its consequences. Ezra Pruitt, the store's proprietor, stood behind his counter looking harried, while his wife Mildred attempted to calm an agitated cluster of farmers near the door. Grain shipments from Denver won't arrive until spring at the earliest, one man was saying. The rail line's been delayed on account of the flooding further east. Then what are we supposed to do, starve through the winter? Another voice demanded. Hester recognized the second speaker as Thaddeus Cole, a farmer whose own fields had failed as badly as everyone else's that year. He turned as she entered, and something calculating flickered across his expression. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Sullivan," he said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Seems you're about the only one in this valley who managed a decent harvest this year." The other conversations in the store died away as attention shifted toward Hester. She felt her cheeks warm under the sudden scrutiny, though she kept her chin lifted and her voice steady. "I worked hard for what I have, Mr. Cole." "Same as anyone else would have, given the right conditions." "Right conditions," Cole repeated, his tone carrying an edge of bitterness. "Must be nice, having that creek running right along your property while the rest of us watched our wells run dry. The creek's been there since before Jacob and I settled that land. I didn't create the drought and I certainly didn't wish it on my neighbors." Mildred Prout stepped forward, placing a placating hand on Cole's arm. "Now, Thaddeus, that's enough. Mrs. Sullivan's harvest might be exactly what saves this town if we're smart about how we handle it." "Smart," Cole scoffed. "You mean if she's willing to hand it over for whatever price we can scrape together, when Colton's already offered her twice what any of us could match?" Hester's temper flared despite her efforts to remain calm. "I turned down Colton's offer, Mr. Cole, precisely because I have no intention of selling my harvest to a man who cares nothing for this town's welfare. If you'd rather insult me than thank me, I suppose that tells me exactly where I stand with my neighbors." She turned and walked out of the store without completing her purchase, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt as she made her way back down the main road. She had not gone far when she heard footsteps hurrying to catch up with her, and turned to find Nathan Hartwell falling into step beside her. "Mrs. Sullivan." "I couldn't help overhearing some of that back at the store." "Then you heard how grateful this town is for my hard work," Hester said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "You heard one frightened man saying foolish things out of desperation. That's not the whole town, ma'am. Isn't it? 2 years I've managed that homestead alone, and in all that time I don't believe more than a handful of folks have bothered to ask how I'm faring, let alone offered a hand with the harder chores. Now suddenly my wheat is valuable, and everyone remembers I exist." Nathan walked alongside her in silence for a long moment before speaking again. "For what it's worth, I don't think that's fair to you, and I told Marshal Boone as much when I reported back on the Colton situation." Hester glanced at him, surprised. "You reported on what happened?" "I did. Told him plain that Colton's men had no business threatening a widow over her own property, and that if this town wanted to survive the winter, they'd be better served treating you like a neighbor worth respecting instead of a resource to be squeezed dry." Despite herself, Hester felt a small measure of the tension in her shoulders ease. And what did Marshal Boone have to say to that? Not much, if I'm honest. He's getting on in years and mostly wants to avoid trouble with Colton, given how much influence the man holds over local commerce. But I intend to keep an eye on things regardless, ma'am, badge or no badge. They had reached the fork in the road where the path split toward Hester's homestead, and she paused, studying the deputy marshal with a curious tilt of her head. "Why does it matter to you, Marshal Hartwell? You're new to this district. You could ride on to easier territory anytime you pleased, and no one would think less of you for it." Nathan considered the question seriously before answering. "I suppose because I've seen what happens in towns where the strong take advantage of the vulnerable and nobody stands against it. I lost my own family's ranch that way, some years back, to a land baron who cared more for his own profit than for the families he displaced. I don't aim to stand idle while it happens again, not if I've got any say in the matter." There was a rawness in his voice that told Hester this was no idle sympathy, but a wound of his own that had never fully healed. She found herself wanting to know more, though she held her tongue, sensing that trust between them, however quickly it seemed to be growing, still needed time to settle properly. "Well," she said finally, "I thank you for the escort, Marshal. though I suppose I managed that walk plenty of times on my own before you arrived in town." "No doubt you did, ma'am, though I hope you won't mind the company all the same." Something in his tone, warm and a touch playful despite the day's tension, drew an unexpected smile from Hester. "I suppose I don't mind it terribly." They parted ways at the fork, and as Hester continued toward home, she found her thoughts lingering on the deputy marshal far longer than she cared to admit, even to herself. The days that followed brought little relief to Millbrook's mounting anxiety. The drought showed no sign of breaking, and reports filtered in from neighboring counties describing conditions just as dire. Cattle were being sold off at reduced prices simply to spare ranchers the cost of feeding them through a lean winter, and more than one family in Millbrook had begun quietly discussing whether they ought to pack up and seek better fortune further west or south, where rumors suggested the drought had been less severe. Hester continued working her field from dawn until dusk, bringing in the wheat harvest bushel by careful bushel, storing what she could in the modest barn Jacob had built years before. The physical labor left her exhausted each night, but it also gave her mind blessed relief from the worry that gnawed at her whenever she paused too long to think about the winter ahead. It was during one such exhausting afternoon, nearly a week after her confrontation with Colton's men, that Nathan Hartwell appeared again at the edge of her field, this time alone and without any pretense of official business. "Marshal Hartwell," Hester called out, straightening from where she had been bent over a row of wheat stalks, her scythe resting against her hip. "Come to check on Millbrook's most contentious harvest again." Nathan dismounted and approached, and Hester noticed he had traded his official vest for a simple work shirt, sleeves rolled up past his forearms. "Actually, ma'am, I came to offer my help if you'll allow it. Seemed to me you could use an extra pair of hands, and I find myself with a free afternoon." Hester eyed him skeptically. A deputy marshal offering to work a widow's field. Won't that raise talk in town? Let them talk. "I've never much cared for gossip, and I doubt you have either, given how you handled Thaddeus Cole at the general store." Despite her hesitation, Hester found herself grateful for the offer. The harvest was far from finished, and her body ached with the strain of managing it alone. "Well, I won't turn away good help when it's offered honestly. There's a second scythe in the barn if you're serious about earning your keep." Nathan retrieved the tool and joined her in the field, and for the next several hours, they worked side by side in companionable silence, broken occasionally by conversation that ranged from practical matters of farming to lighter topics that revealed more of each other's characters. Hester learned that Nathan had grown up on a modest ranch in Kansas before his family lost the land to a wealthy rancher's aggressive expansion, a loss that had driven him first to work as a ranch hand and later to pursue law enforcement, hoping to prevent similar injustices from befalling other families. "That's a hard thing," Hester said, pausing to wipe sweat from her brow as the afternoon sun beat down on them. "Losing land your family worked so hard to build. Harder still watching my father's spirit break afterward. He'd poured everything into that ranch, and losing it took something from him he never quite got back. He passed a few years later, and I've always believed the loss of that land hastened it." "I'm sorry, Nathan." It was the first time she had used his given name, and she noticed the way his expression softened at the sound of it. "Thank you, Hester." Her name, in turn, sounded different coming from his lips than it ever had from anyone else's, carrying a warmth that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. They continued working until the sun began sinking toward the western ridge, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and violet. As they finally set down their scythes and surveyed the day's progress, Hester felt a swell of gratitude that surprised her with its intensity. "I don't know how to properly thank you for this," she admitted. "It would have taken me another full day alone to clear this section." "You don't need to thank me, Hester. Truth be told, I've enjoyed the work. Reminds me of better days before everything went wrong with my family's ranch." They stood together at the edge of the field, watching the sunset in silence, and Hester found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the warmth radiating from him despite the cooling evening air, the steady rhythm of his breathing after the day's exertion. When he finally turned to look at her, something passed between them that neither seemed quite ready to name, though both recognized its presence. "I should be getting back to town," Nathan said finally, though his voice carried reluctance. "Marshal Boone will wonder where I've disappeared to all afternoon." "Of course. Thank you again, Nathan, truly." He mounted his horse but paused before riding off. "Would it be too forward of me to ask if I might return tomorrow? There's still plenty of field left to harvest, and I find I don't mind the company nearly as much as I expected to." Hester's heart fluttered at the request, though she kept her expression composed. "I wouldn't object to that at all, Marshal Hartwell." His smile, warm and genuine, lingered in her thoughts long after he had ridden away into the gathering dusk. Over the following 2 weeks, Nathan returned to Hester's homestead nearly every day that his duties allowed, and their working partnership gradually deepened into something neither of them had anticipated but both had come to treasure. They finished the wheat harvest together, filling the barn with more grain than Hester had dared hope for, and began discussing what to do with the surplus once her own household's needs were secured. It was during one such discussion, as they sat together on the porch steps sharing a simple supper of bread and stew after a long day's work, that the true weight of Millbrook's situation became clear to both of them. "I spoke with Doc Ferris yesterday," Nathan said, breaking a piece of bread and passing half to Hester. "He tells me 3 families in town have already run through their winter stores, and it's not even November yet. Children are going hungry, Hester. The Whitfield boy fainted at school last week from lack of proper food." Hester's chest tightened at the news. "I hadn't heard that. Most folks are too proud or too frightened to admit how bad things have gotten. But it's grim, and it's only going to worsen as winter deepens." Hester was quiet for a long moment, staring out at her fields where the harvested wheat now stood stacked and stored, more than enough to see her own household through the cold months ahead with plenty to spare. "I have to do something, Nathan. I can't sit on a full harvest while children in this town go hungry, regardless of how those same folks treated me before." Nathan studied her with an expression of quiet admiration. "That's a generous heart you carry, Hester Sullivan, especially given how little generosity this town has shown you in return. Generosity shouldn't depend on what we receive in return. Jacob always believed that, and I've tried to honor it even when it's difficult." She paused, then added more quietly, "especially when it's difficult." "What did you have in mind?" Hester considered the question carefully before answering. "I think I need to call a town meeting, lay out exactly what I have, and offer to share it at fair prices those struggling can actually afford, or in trade for labor and goods from those who have nothing else to offer. It won't solve everything, but it might be enough to see the town through until spring." "That's a bold plan. Colton won't like it. If you undercut whatever price he's charging for grain shipped in from outside, he'll see it as a direct threat to his business interests. Let him be threatened. I'm done letting fear of Amos Colton dictate how I treat my neighbors." Nathan reached over and took her hand, a gesture so natural it seemed to surprise them both. "I'll stand behind you on this, Hester. Whatever trouble it stirs up with Colton, you won't face it alone." Hester looked down at their joined hands, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the autumn evening's lingering heat. "Thank you, Nathan, for everything. I don't know how I would have managed this harvest without you." "You'd have managed just fine, I expect. You're stronger than most folks give you credit for, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out all the same." Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke, the unspoken tenderness between them growing too large to easily contain. Finally, Nathan leaned forward, his movement slow and questioning, giving Hester every opportunity to pull away if she wished. She did not pull away. Instead, she met him halfway, and their first kiss was gentle, warm, tasting faintly of the bread and stew they had shared. carrying within it 2 years of loneliness finally beginning to heal. When they parted, Hester felt breathless in a way she had not experienced since her earliest days courting Jacob, decades of feeling seeming to compress into this single moment of connection. "I hope that wasn't too forward," Nathan said softly, though his eyes carried no real doubt. "It wasn't forward at all," Hester replied, her voice equally soft. "It was exactly what I didn't know I needed." They sat together on the porch steps as darkness fully settled over the homestead, hands entwined, speaking little but finding comfort simply in each other's presence, until Nathan finally had to take his leave to return to town before his absence drew unwanted questions. The town meeting Hester called took place 3 days later in the largest available space in Millbrook, the saloon owned by a gruff but fair-minded man named Otis Grimm, who cleared out his gaming tables to accommodate the gathering crowd. Word had spread quickly of Hester's intentions, and nearly every family in town turned out, filling the saloon with anxious murmuring as they waited for the meeting to begin. Hester stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, some hopeful, others skeptical, and a few, belonging to men like Thaddeus Cole, still carrying traces of the resentment that had colored their earlier interactions. Nathan stood near the back of the room, his presence a quiet source of strength even from a distance. "Thank you all for coming," Hester began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know most of you are here because you've heard about my wheat harvest, and I won't waste time pretending otherwise. This year's drought has hit every family in this valley hard, and I don't believe any of us can afford to let pride or old grievances stand between us and getting through the winter ahead." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "My harvest this year was larger than I expected, thanks in no small part to help I received from Marshal Hartwell." She glanced toward Nathan, who offered a small nod of acknowledgement. "I have more grain stored in my barn than my own household will need to see through winter, and I intend to share that surplus with this town." A ripple of surprised murmuring moved through the crowd. Ezra Prout spoke up from near the front. "Share it how, Mrs. Sullivan? At what price?" "At a price fair to what folks can actually afford, not what desperation might otherwise force them to pay. For families who have coin, I'll sell at cost, no more. For families who have nothing, I'll trade for labor for goods, for whatever fair exchange we can agree upon together. What I won't do is let anyone in this town go hungry while grain sits unused in my barn." Silence held the room for a long moment before Mildred Prout stepped forward, her eyes shining with unexpected emotion. "Mrs. Sullivan, that's more generous than any of us have any right to expect, given how little thanks you've received from this town these past 2 years. I don't need thanks, Mrs. Prout. I need this town to survive the winter, same as everyone gathered here. What happened before doesn't matter half as much as what we do now together." Thaddeus Cole, standing near the back with his arms crossed, finally spoke. "And what happens when Colton hears about this arrangement? You think he'll take kindly to you undercutting whatever price he's charging for grain shipped in?" Nathan stepped forward before Hester could answer. "Colton's business dealings are his own concern, Mr. Cole, but no law in this territory prevents Mrs. Sullivan from selling or trading her own harvest as she sees fit, at whatever price she chooses to set. If Colton has an issue with fair competition, he's welcome to bring it to me directly." The firm authority in Nathan's voice seemed to settle the room's remaining doubts, and gradually the mood shifted from skepticism to cautious hope. By the meeting's end, nearly every family present had agreed to some arrangement with Hester, whether through direct purchase, trade of goods, or promised labor to be repaid come spring planting season. As the crowd began dispersing, Hester found herself surrounded by neighbors offering genuine thanks for the first time in longer than she cared to remember. Mildred Prout embraced her warmly, tears in her eyes as she spoke of how her family had feared facing winter with nothing but empty shelves. Even Thaddeus Cole approached, his earlier hostility replaced by grudging but sincere gratitude. "I spoke out of turn before, Mrs. Sullivan," he admitted, refusing to quite meet her eyes. "Fear does strange things to a man's tongue. I'm sorry for the way I treated you at the store." "Apology accepted, Mr. Cole. We're neighbors, and neighbors ought to help each other through hard times, not tear each other down." As the saloon finally emptied, Nathan approached Hester, his expression carrying quiet pride. "You did something remarkable here tonight, Hester. This town will remember it, I think, long after the drought's memory fades." "I hope you're right. Though I confess, part of me still wonders if it will be enough to see everyone through." "It's a start, same as I told you weeks ago. Sometimes a start is all we can offer, and the rest we simply have to trust will follow." They walked out into the cool evening air together, and Nathan offered to escort her home, an offer she gladly accepted. As they walked the familiar road toward her homestead beneath a canopy of brilliant stars, Hester felt a contentment she had not experienced in the 2 long years since Jacob's passing, a sense that perhaps, finally, brighter days lay ahead. But brighter days, as it happened, would not arrive without one final trial to face. Word of the town meeting reached Amos Colton within days, carried by Silas Reed and the other ranch hands who had witnessed Hester's earlier defiance. Colton, a heavy-set man in his 50s with cold, calculating eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness in business dealings, arrived at Hester's homestead unannounced on a crisp morning nearly a week after the meeting, accompanied by 4 armed men whose presence carried clear intimidation. Hester was in her barn, sorting the remaining grain for distribution to families who had arranged trades, when she heard the approaching horses and stepped outside to find Colton dismounting near her fence line, his expression carrying barely concealed anger. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice deceptively pleasant despite the hard glint in his eyes. "I hear you've been playing charity woman with your harvest, undercutting honest business arrangements in this county." "I've been helping my neighbors survive a hard winter, Mr. Colton. I wasn't aware charity required your permission." "Charity's one thing. Deliberately undermining grain prices I've already negotiated with suppliers from Denver is another matter entirely. You've cost me considerable business these past days, ma'am, and I don't take kindly to losses of that nature. Perhaps if your prices had been fair to begin with, families wouldn't have looked elsewhere for grain they could actually afford." Colton's jaw tightened, and for a moment Hester feared she had pushed too far. But before he could respond, the sound of another horse approaching drew both their attention, and Hester felt relief flood through her as Nathan rode into view, his expression grim as he took in the scene before him. "Mr. Colton," Nathan said, dismounting and positioning himself deliberately between Colton's men and Hester. "This is a surprise. I wasn't aware you made habit of personally visiting homesteads to discuss business grievances. This isn't your concern, Marshal. This is a matter between myself and Mrs. Sullivan regarding fair business practices in this county. Threatening a widow on her own property with armed men certainly falls under my concern, Mr. Colton. I'd advise you to remember that before this conversation continues any further." Colton's expression darkened, but something in Nathan's steady, unwavering gaze seemed to give him pause. "I'm not threatening anyone, Marshal, merely expressing my dissatisfaction with practices that undermine legitimate commerce. Selling grain at fair prices to hungry families isn't undermining commerce, Mr. Colton. It's basic human decency, something this county could use considerably more of, in my observation." The tension between the 2 men stretched taut as a bowstring, and Hester found herself holding her breath, uncertain how the confrontation might resolve. Finally, Colton's gaze shifted back to her, calculation replacing some of his earlier anger. "You've made yourself an enemy, Mrs. Sullivan, whether you realize it or not. I don't forget slights easily, and I have considerable influence in matters affecting this county's future. I've survived worse than your displeasure, Mr. Colton. I buried my husband and managed this homestead alone for 2 years without your help or anyone else's. I imagine I'll manage to survive your displeasure just fine as well. Something in her steady defiance seemed to finally deflate Colton's remaining bluster. He studied her for a long moment, then Nathan, apparently recognizing that further confrontation would accomplish little beyond damaging his own reputation further, given Nathan's clear willingness to intervene on Hester's behalf. "This isn't finished," Colton muttered, though the threat carried less weight than his earlier words. He mounted his horse and gestured for his men to follow, riding off in a cloud of dust that seemed to carry away much of the day's tension with it. Once they had disappeared from view, Hester finally allowed herself to release the breath she had been holding, her hands trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. Nathan turned to her immediately, concern evident in his expression. "Are you all right?" "I think so. Thank you for coming when you did. I confess I was rather more frightened than I let on." "You didn't show it. You stood your ground admirably, Hester. I don't know many folks, man or woman, who could have faced Colton down the way you just did." "I had considerable motivation. Watching those men eye my barn like they meant to help themselves to what's inside." Nathan's expression grew serious. "I don't think Colton's finished making trouble, even if he's backed off for now. A man like that doesn't easily accept being bested, especially not by someone he considers beneath him. What do you suggest we do about it?" "For now, I intend to keep a closer watch on your homestead, particularly given how many folks in town are relying on your continued generosity to see them through winter. I'll speak with Marshal Boone as well, make certain he understands the full situation regarding Colton's behavior today." Hester studied him with genuine gratitude, though something else stirred within her as well, a recognition of just how deeply she had come to rely on his presence, his protection, his quiet, unwavering support. "I don't know what I would have done these past weeks without you, Nathan. You'd have managed, same as you always have. But I'm grateful I didn't have to watch you face it alone." He reached for her hand, and she allowed him to draw her close, resting her head against his chest as the autumn wind rustled through the nearby trees. In that moment, surrounded by the fading tension of Colton's visit, Hester felt something settle within her that had been unsettled since Jacob's passing, a sense that perhaps she was not, after all, meant to face life's hardships entirely alone. The weeks that followed brought increasing closeness between Hester and Nathan, their working partnership evolving into genuine courtship as autumn deepened toward winter. Nathan continued splitting his duties between his official responsibilities as deputy marshal and increasingly frequent visits to Hester's homestead, where their evenings together grew into cherished routine, sharing meals, discussing the day's events, and gradually opening themselves more fully to the growing affection between them. Millbrook itself began showing signs of recovery as Hester's grain distribution continued, supplemented by trades and labor arrangements that saw families helping one another in ways that had grown increasingly rare during the drought's harshest months. The Whitfield family, whose young son had fainted from hunger, received enough grain to see them comfortably through winter in exchange for the father's skilled carpentry work, repairing several homesteads' storm-damaged fences and structures. Thaddeus Cole, in a gesture that surprised many who remembered his earlier hostility, organized a group of farmers to help repair the schoolhouse roof in gratitude for Hester's generosity, ensuring local children would have a warm, dry place to continue their education despite the season's hardships. Even Marshal Boone, initially reluctant to involve himself in matters concerning Colton's business dealings, began taking a firmer stance after witnessing the positive changes rippling through Millbrook as a result of Hester's harvest sharing. He formally warned Colton against any further intimidation tactics directed at the widow Sullivan, citing the earlier confrontation Nathan had reported, and while Colton's resentment simmered beneath the surface, he made no further direct attempts to interfere with Hester's arrangements. It was during a particularly clear November evening, as the first true frost of the season silvered the fields surrounding Hester's homestead, that Nathan arrived with something clearly weighing on his mind. Hester noticed his uncharacteristic quiet as they sat together by the fireplace after supper, and finally set aside her mending to address it directly. "You've been unusually thoughtful this evening, Nathan. Is something troubling you?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the crackling fire before finally meeting her eyes. "I've been thinking about the future, Hester, about what comes after this winter passes, after the immediate crisis has eased. And what conclusions have you reached? That I don't want to imagine a future that doesn't include you in it." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the firelight, a simple silver ring that had clearly seen careful polishing despite its modest craftsmanship. "This belonged to my mother. It's not much, I know, especially compared to what you deserve. But I love you, Hester Sullivan, more deeply than I ever expected to love anyone again after losing my family's ranch and everything that came with it. I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me." Hester felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelming emotion making speech difficult for a long moment. When she finally found her voice, it emerged soft but certain. "Nathan Hartwell, I never expected to love again either, not after losing Jacob. But these past months with you have taught me that love doesn't diminish what came before. It simply opens space for what comes next. Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Nathan's face broke into a smile of pure joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into an embrace that spoke of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming happiness all intertwined. Their kiss that followed carried none of the tentative uncertainty of their first, but instead, a deep, confident tenderness born of months spent building genuine trust and affection. "I should warn you," Hester said eventually, laughing softly against his shoulder, "marrying a widow farmer comes with certain complications. This homestead, the responsibilities that come with it, they're not simple things to take on." "I've never wanted simple things, Hester. I want this. I want you and this land and whatever future we build together on it." They sat together late into the night, discussing practical matters alongside dreams for their shared future, the fire slowly burning down to embers as outside. The first true snow of winter began drifting softly down over the fields that had, against considerable odds, provided salvation for an entire struggling town. Their wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a crisp December morning, in the small Millbrook church that had witnessed generations of the town's joys and sorrows alike. Nearly the entire town turned out for the ceremony, a testament to how thoroughly attitudes toward Hester had shifted since the difficult days following her husband's passing. Mildred Prout helped Hester prepare, lending her own mother's wedding veil for the occasion, while Ezra Prout organized several men to decorate the church with evergreen boughs, and whatever late-season flowers could still be found despite the season's chill. Marshal Boone, despite his earlier reluctance to involve himself directly in Colton's business, proudly stood as witness alongside Nathan, having grown to genuinely respect the younger deputy's principled stance throughout the autumn's difficulties. Even Thaddeus Cole attended, sitting near the front pews with his own family, his earlier hostility long since transformed into genuine friendship and respect. As Hester walked down the simple aisle toward where Nathan waited, dressed in his best suit with his badge polished and gleaming, she felt none of the uncertainty that had colored her life these past difficult years. Instead, she felt only profound gratitude for the harvest that had saved not just her own household but an entire community, and for the man whose steady presence had helped guide that harvest's blessings to where they were needed most. "Do you, Nathan Hartwell, take this woman to be your lawful wife?" the preacher asked, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. "I do," Nathan replied, his eyes never leaving Hester's face, "with my whole heart for as long as I live." "And do you, Hester Sullivan, take this man to be your lawful husband?" "I do," Hester answered, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling within her chest. "For all the days remaining to us and gladly." Their kiss, when the preacher finally pronounced them married, drew warm applause from the assembled townsfolk, many of whom had tears in their eyes as they witnessed the culmination of a romance that had blossomed from such unlikely beginnings, born from crisis, and sustained through genuine partnership and mutual respect. The celebration that followed at the town saloon, generously hosted free of charge by Otis Grimm in honor of the occasion, stretched well into the evening, filled with music, dancing, and the kind of communal joy that Millbrook had sorely lacked during the difficult drought months. Even Amos Colton, though notably absent from the festivities himself, sent no further trouble their way, having apparently concluded that continued conflict with the newly married couple, now united in both love and evident community support, would serve no useful purpose. As winter deepened following their marriage, Nathan officially took up residence at Hester's homestead, requesting reassignment from his mobile deputy duties to a more permanent position as Millbrook's town marshal, a request Marshal Boone readily granted given his own advancing age and desire to eventually retire from active duty. The arrangement suited both Nathan and Hester perfectly, allowing him to maintain his commitment to protecting the town's welfare, while also dedicating himself to building their shared life together on the homestead that had brought them together in the first place. Spring arrived with its usual gradual thaw, bringing renewed hope after the harsh winter months, and with it came planting season once again. This time, however, Hester did not face the labor alone. Nathan worked alongside her from dawn until dusk, and their combined efforts, along with grateful neighbors who remembered the previous autumn's generosity, ensured the fields were planted more thoroughly and efficiently than Hester had managed in any previous year since Jacob's passing. The drought, mercifully, broke that spring as well, replaced by seasonal rains that promised a far more bountiful harvest than the previous year's desperate struggle. As the wheat began growing tall and green across Hester's fields once more, she found herself reflecting on how dramatically her circumstances had changed in the span of less than a year, from isolated widow struggling alone against an uncertain future, to beloved wife building a genuine partnership with a man whose integrity and devotion had transformed not just her own life, but the fortunes of an entire community. It was during one such reflective evening, as she and Nathan sat together on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, that Hester shared news that brought fresh joy to their already blessed union. "Nathan," she said softly, taking his hand in both of hers, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, immediately attentive to the emotion evident in her voice. "What is it, my love?" "I'm expecting. We're going to have a child come this autumn." Nathan's face transformed with joy so profound that tears gathered in his eyes, and he pulled her close, careful and tender in his embrace. "A child, Hester, that's the most wonderful news I could imagine. I confess I wondered, after everything with Jacob, whether I would ever have this chance. We tried for children during our marriage, but it never happened, and I had come to accept that perhaps motherhood simply wasn't meant for me. Perhaps it wasn't meant for you then, but it's meant for you now, with me, in this life we're building together." Nathan pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, then to her lips, his happiness evident in every gesture. "I love you so completely, Hester. This news only deepens that love beyond what I thought possible." They spent that evening making plans for the future, discussing names, imagining what their child might look like, whether they might have Nathan's dark hair or Hester's warmer brown, his steady gray eyes or her more expressive hazel ones. The conversation carried them well past sunset, until stars filled the sky above their homestead, witnesses to a happiness neither had dared hope for during the difficult days of the previous autumn's drought. Word of Hester's pregnancy spread through Millbrook with the same speed that had once carried news of her defiant harvest, but this time, the reaction carried nothing but genuine warmth and celebration. Mildred Prout organized a small gathering of the town's women to prepare baby clothes and blankets, while several of the men, led by Thaddeus Cole, took it upon themselves to help Nathan expand the modest farmhouse to accommodate their growing family, adding an additional room that would eventually serve as a nursery. The gesture moved Hester deeply, representing as it did the complete transformation of her relationship with the town she called home. Where once she had felt forgotten and overlooked, she now found herself surrounded by genuine community support, neighbors who remembered her generosity during the drought and were eager to return that kindness manifold now that circumstances allowed. "I never expected this," Hester admitted to Nathan one evening as they watched the nursery construction nearing completion, fresh lumber gleaming golden in the late spring sunlight. "After everything that happened before you arrived, I had resigned myself to believing this town simply didn't value what I contributed. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind people what truly matters," Nathan replied, his arm wrapped comfortably around her shoulders as they surveyed the progress. "You gave this town a reason to remember their better nature, Hester. That's no small gift. We gave them that reason together. I couldn't have managed any of it without you standing beside me. Perhaps, but the harvest was yours, my love. Your hard work, your generosity, your courage in facing down Colton when lesser folks might have simply capitulated to his demands. I merely had the good fortune to witness it and fall completely in love with the woman responsible." Their months of preparation for the baby's arrival passed in a blur of contentment and quiet joy, punctuated by the ordinary rhythms of homestead life, planting and tending crops, managing livestock, and the gradual deepening of their marriage as they learned each other's habits and preferences, built shared routines, and discovered the particular comfort that came from facing life's challenges as genuine partners rather than isolated individuals. Summer brought its usual demanding labor, tending the growing wheat crop that promised, mercifully, to be even more bountiful than the previous drought-stricken year's harvest. Nathan divided his time between homestead duties and his responsibilities as town marshal, a role he had grown into with the same steady, principled dedication he had shown from their very first meeting. Under his watch, Millbrook experienced a period of relative peace and prosperity, the earlier tensions surrounding Colton's business dealings having largely subsided as the rancher redirected his ambitions toward more distant markets, apparently having learned that Millbrook's community, once roused to solidarity, would not easily be intimidated or manipulated for his personal profit. As summer gave way to early autumn, Hester's pregnancy advanced toward its conclusion, and preparations for both the harvest and the impending birth occupied much of their attention. Nathan had grown increasingly attentive as her due date approached, insisting she rest more frequently despite her protests that she felt perfectly capable of continuing her usual duties around the homestead. "You worked through an entire harvest last year while managing this homestead alone," Nathan pointed out one particularly warm September afternoon, as he gently but firmly guided Hester toward a chair on their porch, ignoring her token resistance. "Surely you can allow yourself the luxury of rest now, especially in your condition. I'm not an invalid, Nathan. Women have managed pregnancy and farm work simultaneously since settlers first arrived in this territory. I'm well aware. I'm simply exercising my prerogative as your husband to worry excessively about your well-being and that of our child." Hester couldn't help but smile at his evident concern, even as she settled into the offered chair with only mild grumbling. "You're going to be an overprotective father, aren't you?" "Undoubtedly. I've waited my whole life for this family, Hester. I don't intend to take any chances with its well-being." His words, spoken with such earnest sincerity, warmed something deep within her chest. She reached for his hand, drawing him down to sit beside her. "You already are the father I always hoped our child would have, Nathan. Steady, principled, endlessly caring. I couldn't have asked for a better partner in this life." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and they looked up to see Mildred Prout hurrying up the path toward their homestead, her expression carrying urgent concern. "Mrs. Sullivan, I mean Mrs. Hartwell," Mildred called out, still adjusting to Hester's new married name after months of habit. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I bring troubling news. There's been an accident at the Colton Ranch. A grass fire spreading fast towards several neighboring properties, including some of ours here in town." Nathan immediately rose to his feet, his expression shifting instantly to alert focus. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that Marshal Boone is calling for every able hand to help fight it before it spreads further. They're worried it might reach the schoolhouse if the wind shifts." Nathan turned to Hester, clear conflict evident in his expression. "I need to go help, but I don't want to leave you alone, not with the baby so close to arriving." "Go, Nathan. This town needs you, and I'll be perfectly fine here. I'm not due for another 2 weeks at least, according to Doc Ferris's estimation." "Are you certain?" "Completely certain. Go help fight that fire before it spreads any further. I'll manage just fine until you return." Nathan pressed a quick but tender kiss to her forehead before hurrying to saddle his horse, riding off toward town alongside Mildred Pruitt's husband, who had arrived moments later with his own wagon to help coordinate the response. Hester watched him disappear down the road, praying silently for his safety and for the town's continued good fortune despite this unexpected crisis. The grass fire, as it turned out, proved a serious but ultimately manageable threat, contained through the combined efforts of nearly every able-bodied person in Millbrook working together with practiced efficiency born from their shared experiences during the previous year's drought crisis. Nathan returned home well after dark, exhausted and smelling of smoke, but otherwise unharmed, having helped organize a bucket brigade that successfully protected the schoolhouse and several nearby homesteads from the fire's advance. "It's contained," he reported to Hester as she helped him wash the soot from his face and hands. "Burned through a good portion of Colton's western pasture before we managed to stop it, but no serious injuries, and the schoolhouse is safe. Thank goodness." And Colton himself, angry, of course, about the pasture loss, but even he seemed grateful for the town's quick response in helping contain it before it spread to his remaining property or beyond toward the settlement. I think, perhaps, this crisis did something to remind him that community cooperation serves everyone's interests better than the isolated self-interest he's practiced these past years. "Perhaps this town has learned something valuable this past year," Hester mused, gently tending to a small burn on Nathan's forearm. "About the importance of looking after one another, regardless of old grievances or business rivalries." "I think you're right, and I think much of that lesson traces back to your generosity during the drought, Hester. You showed this town what genuine community looks like, and I believe today's response to the fire reflects that lesson taking deeper root." 2 weeks later, precisely as Doc Ferris had estimated, Hester went into labor on a mild October morning, the wheat harvest having been successfully completed just days before, filling their barn with abundance that stood in stark contrast to the desperate scarcity of the previous year. Nathan, true to his earlier promise, remained by her side throughout the long hours of labor, his steady presence providing comfort even as Doc Ferris and Mildred Pruitt, who had become close friends with Hester over the preceding months, attended to the actual birth. After nearly 12 hours of labor, their son was born, healthy and strong, his cries filling the farmhouse with sounds of new life that seemed to echo the renewal Millbrook itself had experienced over the preceding year. Nathan held his son for the first time with hands that trembled slightly, tears of overwhelming joy tracking down his face as he gazed upon the tiny features that already showed hints of both his own dark hair and Hester's more delicate bone structure. "He's perfect," Nathan whispered, carefully passing the swaddled infant to Hester, who lay exhausted but radiant against her pillows. "Absolutely perfect. What shall we name him?" Hester asked softly, gazing down at their son with wonder evident in her expression. Nathan considered the question seriously before answering. "What about Jacob, in honor of your first husband? He deserves to be remembered, and I think it fitting that our son might carry forward some piece of that memory." Hester's eyes filled with grateful tears at the suggestion, touched deeply by Nathan's thoughtfulness. Jacob Hartwell. I think that's a beautiful name, Nathan. Thank you for suggesting it. It seemed right. Jacob built this homestead alongside you, laid the foundation for everything we've built together since. It seems only fitting his memory should live on through our son. They spent that evening in quiet contentment, marveling at their new son and the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. From Hester's isolated struggle to save her harvest and her homestead, through the growing partnership and love that had blossomed with Nathan, to this culmination of family and community restored. News of baby Jacob's birth spread quickly through Millbrook, bringing another wave of well wishes and gifts from neighbors who had come to genuinely cherish the Hartwell family's place within their community. Mildred Prout organized meals to be delivered daily during Hester's recovery, while Thaddeus Cole and several other farmers took turns helping Nathan manage the homestead's daily chores until Hester regained her full strength. As autumn deepened into winter once more, exactly 1 year after the drought crisis that had first brought Nathan into Hester's life, the Hartwell family settled into comfortable domestic routine, their homestead now filled with the joyful chaos of a growing infant, alongside the steady rhythms of successful farm management. The wheat harvest that year proved bountiful enough to not only secure their own household's needs, but to contribute generously once again to the town's collective welfare, this time not from desperate necessity, but from genuine abundance and continued commitment to community support. Marshal Boone officially retired that winter, and true to earlier arrangements, Nathan assumed full responsibilities as Millbrook's town marshal, a position he would hold with quiet dedication for many years to come. Under his continued watch, the town experienced sustained peace and prosperity, the earlier tensions with Colton's business interests having largely resolved into a wary but functional coexistence that served both parties' legitimate interests without further conflict or intimidation. As their son grew through his first year, taking his earliest steps in the same fields where his parents had first fallen in love amid the desperate labor of harvest season, Hester often found herself reflecting on how completely her life had transformed since that fateful autumn when Colton's men had first appeared at her field's edge, threatening to take by intimidation what she had built through years of solitary hard work. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked Nathan one evening, nearly 18 months after their son's birth, as they watched young Jacob attempting his wobbly first steps across their porch floor, delighted laughter bubbling from him as he stumbled and caught himself against a supporting chair. "How do you mean?" Nathan asked, watching their son's progress with evident pride and amusement. "If you hadn't ridden out with Colton's men that day, if you had simply enforced whatever agreement they demanded, rather than standing beside me against it." Nathan turned to her, his expression serious despite the playful domestic scene surrounding them. "I don't like imagining that version of events, Hester. Though I suppose, even then, I don't believe I could have simply stood aside and watched Colton's men bully a widow out of her rightful harvest. Something about you, even in that first meeting, struck me as someone deserving far better treatment than this town had shown you. I'm grateful you felt that way, grateful beyond what words can properly express. As am I, for the courage you showed in standing your ground, and for the generosity you displayed once that harvest was secured. This town owes you a debt it can never fully repay, Hester, though I think perhaps the past year's continued prosperity represents at least some measure of appropriate gratitude finally being shown." Their conversation was interrupted by young Jacob's delighted squeal as he successfully navigated several steps without stumbling, reaching his small arms up toward his parents in evident triumph. Both Hester and Nathan laughed with genuine joy, scooping their son up between them in a warm embrace that spoke volumes about the family they had built together against considerable odds. That spring brought news that would further cement the transformation Millbrook had undergone since the difficult drought year that had first brought Hester and Nathan together. A delegation of town leaders, including Ezra Prout, Thaddeus Cole, and several other prominent farmers, approached the Hartwell homestead with a formal proposal that touched Hester deeply when she heard its full details. "We want to establish an annual harvest festival," Ezra explained, standing somewhat awkwardly on the Hartwell porch alongside his companions. "In recognition of what your generosity meant to this town during that terrible drought year. We thought perhaps calling it Sullivan's Harvest, in honor of the name you carried when you first saved us." Hester felt tears gathering as she absorbed the proposal's significance. "You want to name a festival after me? After what you taught this town about community and generosity," Thaddeus Cole clarified, his expression carrying genuine sincerity that stood in stark contrast to his earlier hostility during those desperate autumn days. "Many of us treated you poorly before that harvest, Mrs. Hartwell. This festival seems a small way of acknowledging that debt and ensuring future generations remember the lesson your generosity taught us." Nathan, standing beside Hester with their young son balanced on his hip, squeezed her hand supportively as she struggled to find appropriate words to respond to such an unexpected and moving gesture. "I would be honored," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Truly honored, though I want it understood that any credit belongs equally to this town's own capacity for generosity, once given proper opportunity to demonstrate it. We all helped each other survive that winter together." The first annual Sullivan's Harvest Festival took place that autumn, drawing not just Millbrook's own residents, but visitors from neighboring settlements curious about the celebration's unusual origins. The event featured shared feasting, music, dancing, and various games and competitions, all centered around celebrating the community bonds that had been forged and strengthened during that difficult drought year and its aftermath. Hester and Nathan attended together, their young son Jacob now nearly 2 years old and delighting in the festival's colorful chaos, chasing after other children his age, while adults enjoyed the abundant food and warm camaraderie that had become Millbrook's hallmark in the years since the drought crisis first tested and ultimately strengthened their collective character. As evening settled over the festival grounds, painting the sky in the same brilliant autumn colors that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in their shared story, Nathan drew Hester aside from the main crowd, leading her toward a quiet spot beneath a large oak tree that offered a clear view of the celebration below. "Happy?" he asked simply, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they watched their son playing nearby under the watchful eye of Mildred Prout, who had become like a second mother to young Jacob. "More than I ever thought possible," Hester replied, leaning back contentedly against her husband's chest. "When Jacob first passed, I truly believed happiness like this had ended for me permanently, that I would simply endure, manage the homestead alone, and slowly fade into whatever future remained without genuine joy or partnership. I'm grateful circumstances proved otherwise. As am I, though I sometimes wonder what our lives might have looked like if that drought had never struck, if Colton's men had never come demanding my harvest, if you had never ridden out to keep the peace that day." Nathan considered this thoughtfully before responding. "I think, perhaps, difficult circumstances sometimes create space for unexpected blessings that might never have emerged otherwise. The drought was terrible without question. Real suffering occurred, real hardship that no one should have to endure. But from that suffering came genuine transformation, both in this town's character and in our own lives together. Jacob would have wanted this, I think," Hester said softly, watching their son's namesake laugh delightedly as he chased fallen leaves across the festival grounds. "He always believed generosity given freely eventually returns to bless the giver, though he could never have imagined circumstances quite like these. I like to think he would approve of the life we've built, and of how his memory lives on through our son." They stood together beneath the oak tree as the festival continued below them, two people who had found unexpected love amid crisis and hardship, who had helped transform not just their own lives, but an entire community's character through courage, generosity, and steadfast commitment to doing what was right regardless of personal cost or convenience. The years that followed brought continued prosperity to both the Hartwell family and the broader Millbrook community. Hester and Nathan welcomed a second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Nathan's own mother, born nearly 3 years after their son Jacob, completing their family with the same joy and gratitude that had characterized every milestone of their relationship since that first fateful meeting in Hester's wheat field. Nathan continued serving as Millbrook's marshal for many years, his principled leadership helping maintain the community spirit and mutual support that had emerged from the drought crisis. Under his watch, the town grew and prospered, eventually establishing its own proper schoolhouse building to replace the aging structure that had served previous generations, along with expanded medical facilities that ensured no family would face health crises without adequate support and care. Amos Colton, though he never became a close friend to the Hartwell family, gradually softened his more aggressive business practices over the ensuing years, apparently having genuinely absorbed some lesson from witnessing the community's response to both the drought crisis and the later grass fire emergency. He eventually sold his ranch operations to his own son, who proved considerably more community-minded than his father had been, and relocated to a smaller property where he lived out his remaining years in relative quiet, occasionally attending town functions including, notably, several subsequent Sullivan's Harvest festivals. Hester's original homestead, expanded and improved over the years through Nathan's steady labor and their combined dedication, grew into one of the most productive and respected farms in the entire county, known not just for its agricultural success, but for the generous spirit that continued characterizing how the Hartwell family conducted their affairs, always mindful of neighbors facing hardship, always willing to extend whatever support circumstances allowed. Their children grew strong and healthy, Jacob eventually taking over primary management of the family farm as he reached adulthood, while Sarah pursued education as a teacher, eventually taking charge of Millbrook's growing schoolhouse and educating a new generation of children in the values of community and mutual support that had defined her parents' own remarkable love story. On the 20th anniversary of their marriage, Hester and Nathan stood once again beneath the same oak tree where they had shared that quiet moment during the first Sullivan's Harvest Festival, now surrounded by grown children, grandchildren, and the accumulated blessings of 2 decades spent building a life together grounded in genuine partnership, mutual respect, and unwavering love. "Do you remember?" Hester asked, her hair now touched with gray but her eyes still holding the same warmth that had first drawn Nathan to her all those years before. "How frightened I was that first day, when Colton's men arrived at my field." "I remember," Nathan replied, his own dark hair similarly touched with the passage of years, though his gray eyes remained as steady and devoted as ever. "I remember thinking I had never encountered someone quite so determined to stand her ground despite every disadvantage stacked against her. You saved more than just my harvest that day, Nathan. You saved my entire future, gave me reason to believe in love and partnership again when I had nearly given up hope of experiencing either. You gave this entire town reason to remember what genuine community means, Hester. That harvest of yours, and the generosity you showed in sharing it, transformed Millbrook in ways that continue echoing through every subsequent generation." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their grandchildren play in the same fields where their own love story had first blossomed, where a widow's determination and a lawman's principled courage had combined to save not just one harvest, but an entire community's future, and had given birth to a love story that Millbrook would remember and celebrate for generations to come. As the sun set on that anniversary evening, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had witnessed so many pivotal moments throughout their shared story, Hester Sullivan Hartwell and Nathan Hartwell embraced beneath their oak tree, grateful for every hardship that had led them to this moment, and for the enduring love that had grown from crisis into something permanent, unshakable, and profoundly beautiful, a testament to what could flourish when courage met compassion, and when a forgotten widow's final desperate harvest became the foundation for an entire town's redemption, and for a love story that would be remembered as long as Millbrook's fields continued yielding their golden bounty each autumn season.